most important part. It calls for job training, and it calls for a real jobs program in these communities that have been hit hard by unemployment, poverty, and the gun violence. And so we call for that in everything that we do, from the county budget, from the city budget, from the state budget. We got to have a real jobs program. We got to give people an opportunity to work instead of an opportunity to stand on street corners and sling drugs. People who've dropped out of school, who've been out of work for a long time, they may not have the necessary skills to go to work, so we got to help them. We got to prepare them. We got to give them the job training that's necessary so that they can be ready when the jobs come.
We're talking with Cook County Commissioner Richard Boykin in regards to his 7-point plan to deal with the violence that's going into Chicago. Sorry, I want to make sure that our listeners knew who they're listening to on the radio. I'm sorry. So keep going, talking about your 7-point plan.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
I said I wanted our listeners to know who they were listening to in regards to you being the Cook County Commissioner, and you're talking to us about your 7-point plan, and you were pretty much saying within these communities you have a lot of destabilization as well as the need to create infrastructure and opportunity, and you're saying that's also a part of the plan as well.
No question about it. Absolutely. I mean, you can't look. There are parts of the west side of Chicago, and I'm sure you've driven them, that have not been rebuilt since the riots of 1968, since the death of Dr. King. That is unconscionable. We built up downtown Chicago. We built around Chicago, the near west side, South Loop.
Yes.
We gotta build the west side of Chicago. We gotta build the south side of Chicago. Our south side's going to get a shot in the arm because of the Obama Library. But we got parts of the west side, and this is where all this violence is taking place in a few communities. We got to make sure that we invest in those communities. They need resources in those communities. And so I'm saying that everything that we do relative to a budget standpoint, any dollar that we spend of taxpayer money, we ought to be focused on rebuilding communities that desperately need it.
Do you think that you would be able to implement this overall in the affected areas, or will you just start with one community and then see how it goes and then implement it, across the board?
We're going to try to implement the plan across the board.
Okay.
Just this morning, I spoke to the chairman of the City Black Caucus, Rod Sawyer, and requested an opportunity to come before them to speak to them. Look, the mayor of Chicago has asked for $1.1 billion in borrowing authority. In other words, he wants to borrow $1.1 billion. He says to pay off some debt that Chicago owes. Well, what I've said to the members of the City Black Caucus is, before you vote to saddle our children with debt, because the children growing up in Chicago, people living in Chicago, are the ones who will finance that and pay that back.
Absolutely.
And because of the bond rating in Chicago, it costs a heck of a lot more for them to borrow $1.1 billion than it did a few months ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'm saying is that any vote to approve that borrowing authority should be tied to a jobs program in communities that have been hit hard by violence, unemployment, and poverty. So in other words, Mr. Mayor, I'll sign off on your plan, but you got to put forth a plan right now before I vote that's going to rebuild the west side of Chicago. Mm-hmm. And I need to see money going over there.
Sure.
So how is it going to be possible to get this 7-point plan into action? What does it take?
Well, look, I think it takes courage. I think it takes boldness. I think it takes people who are willing to stand up and say, look, I'm tired about talking about the issues of gun violence. I'm tired about losing a generation of our children. I mean, let me tell you, we had a summit over the weekend at UIC. People came out. I mean, a whole lot of people, community leaders were there, victims of violence were there. I mean, a couple of aldermen were there from the south side, from the west side. People came out, and guess what? They're standing up. They're beginning to stand up because they want something done about this gun violence. If we don't do something about it, this violence will take us under. I mean, so what I think it's going to take, look, it's going to take an investment. The parenting workshops, single parents, single mothers, single fathers, grandparents raising kids, they're having a tough go go of it. They're having a tough time. Many single parents are working minimum wage jobs. They're barely making ends meet.
Sure.
They may need a little assistance in helping to raise those children, right? And so we say it takes a village to raise a child. Well, let's be that village that we talk about. Well, let's use our government resources to make sure that if you got a mother who's raising kids who's drug addicted, let's get her the help that she needs, and let's give the kids the help that they need in order to have a good shot at living the American dream. Nobody said anything about that. The reality of it is these kids deserve to grow up in neighborhoods that are safe. They deserve to grow up and have an opportunity, a chance to live the American dream. But if the parents are children themselves and they're having babies,
yes,
then we have to protect those kids. Right? We have to give the parents the tools that they need. A lot of people say, well, curfew, Rich, that's the responsibility of the parents. They ought to know where their kids are. It's 10 o'clock. Do you know where your kids are?
Yes.
Well, no, look, let me tell you. It's a collective community responsibility. These are our kids that are being killed, that are being shot. I mean, so it's either we'll take charge of this situation or it'll take us under. The University of Chicago says that the cost of gun violence to the city of Chicago last year was $2.5 billion. With a B, $2.5 billion. That's a lot of money.
Yes, it is.
Let me tell you, I'd rather take $2.5 billion and invest it in neighborhoods so that people can give back to the city, so that we can have a thriving community, as opposed to spend it on people who are getting shot for emergency services and for trauma.
Okay. All right, Commissioner Boykin, thank you for calling into the show. We appreciate it.
We appreciate
you
it
really
so
helped to
much.
flesh this out. This is fantastic, because when people hear domestic terrorism,
yes.
that's all they focused on, and you have a very thorough plan. So thank you for taking time out of your afternoon to discuss this with us.
Thank you all very much. I look forward to joining you in studio at some point.
Absolutely.
Good to have you here. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Have a good one. That is Cook County Commissioner Richard Boykin, who on the spur of the moment actually made himself available to talk about, this article comes out about domestic terrorism, which is a big word, but it's a 7-point plan. Very comprehensive. Some of the things that he said that I just think is amazing. He addresses the issue of parenting issues and mental health issues and, employment, job training. All those things that are so relevant and important are part of the plan. And I think the fact that you have aldermen that have had these areas that have never been revitalized, that's why I said, when you vote for somebody, what do they do for you? And that's what I think is amazing.
Yes.
So he addressed what I thought was some key things that really need to be addressed.
We have a caller.
We have a...
Maya, they just told me to call.
Oh, is this Mark Chafee?
Let me look.
Is it the president?
Is this the future president, Mark
If anybody
Chafee?
else calls in, my head is going to go off,
Exactly.
okay?
I've got the Secret Service out here in 6 SUVs now in my driveway.
Yes. Mark posted them on Facebook and said, Mark, you just need to call in and say this to the listening audience of the Maya Akai Show. This is Mark Chafee, who we know from the University of Iowa, who was an instructor. He was from the sociology department. So, Mark, go ahead and put on the table what you talked about. Be careful using the term domestic terrorism.
Well, I think that as soon as we start using labels like domestic terrorism, the importance of it is understanding why we have these labels. If you take a U.S.-made jet piloted by Israeli defense forces and bomb Palestinian camps, that's not terror. But a Palestinian on a bus or a Palestinian with a rocket or something, that's terror. Okay? Mm-hmm. And so, similarly, then when we look at forces going on around the world and when we choose to use the word terrorism versus anything else, it's always about trying to discount violence from one side while approving violence on the other side. Okay? So, I wouldn't argue with whether or not something is domestic terrorism or not. I would just want to always be sensitive to the fact that power is always involved in how we name the world. And so, in looking at it, if can we look at it without legitimizing violence of the state, when we then are saying that the violence of some other group is being used against the state or against community or someone else? In other words, does that really help us understand the process by which violence emerges in gangs or emerges in men with guns who shoot their wives and children, or police who have lost control of their emotional centers on the streets, or whatever it might be? Does it help us understand what the forces are that are at work beneath it? And certainly with violence in the cities and gun violence in the cities, and so many children of color who disappear beneath that violence, you can notice that the state has never been willing to call it terrorism.
Sure,
Of course.
Because then it would have to. It's in a sense legitimating even worse the violence that it already exercises to maintain that inner city as it does, right? So I just always want to lift that the naming of the world is one of the most powerful things we do, and power is always the one trying to demand the currency of naming. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does make a lot of sense.
We just answered that like we're in class.
Yes, we did. Yeah.
Because, I would suggest that with, when you look at 2,000 women a year dying from men who say they love them,
Sure.
With gunplay, along with often with their children and offspring, we never call that terrorism, but it has a pattern, and it's always the same, And so why don't we call that terrorism? Why don't we go after men and train men, or do what we need to do to pull violence away from men that seem so willing to use it, or males, I should say, because young males, I seldom would call are men in gang style. But there's so many different ways in which the way we name it helps us avoid actually seeing it and dealing with it.
Absolutely, I
Very
agree.
true. All right, Mark, thank you for calling in. We
Thank
appreciate
you.
it.
You bet.
All right, have a good one.
Okay.
That's Mark Chafee, our instructor at University of Iowa Sociology Department. So, of course, he was going to break it down like
Yes,
that.
he did.
We both said yes, like we were in class.
We
like
did.
said.
We answered that just like we were at the same time. We were like, yes, it does.
I am really happy that Cook County Commissioner, Boykin called in. Rob,
Me too. Yes.
Rob, big ups on
There's some
that.
powerful people in
I
here.
mean,
Just
that was
get him on the phone.
That was Rob G in action right there.
Get him on the phone.
He was like, "You want him on the phone?" I was
He was
like,
like,
"Yeah, pull that off like that. You go, Rob." But the key thing is, I like when people put something on the table and you read an article. To have him to be able to come in and to discuss it on his own, he's even said, "Hey, I'll come in studio and talk about it."
Sure.
Because the thing is, I think his 7-point plan makes sense. But on the flip side, I think Mark Chafee made a good point about be careful in the language.
I was going to ask him that before he got off the
use.
phone. I was like, do you think that saying domestic terrorism actually frightens people away from actually wanting to, you hear that and it's just like
the thing about it is
a war zone. You hear those words.
You hear terms like domestic violence. I mean, you hear things like domestic terrorism. You hear genocide. You hear you just hear so much going on. Gentrification.
Sure.
When you talk about
But people don't know what that is.
Urban centers.
Yeah.
So the thing is, we probably should be careful with the rhetoric, but let's really address the issues. And what I think is key about the commissioner's 7-point plan is it gets to the heart of the issues.
It gets to the heart of the issue, but I think that, like you said, calling it domestic terror and war zone, when people hear that, then we're going to do the semantics instead of getting to the crux of the problem. We're going to play the semantics. Call it the right thing first. Then we'll deal with, I don't like what you're calling it. I'm not going to...
Because, unfortunately, people get caught up in rhetoric real easy.
It's semantics all the time. And it's like, just never mind that. We'll rename it later. Let's just fix
Let's
what's
focus
going
on these 7 points.
Yes,
and for the University of Chicago to say how much money that the city spends on gun violence, that is wasted resources that could go to rebuilding communities.
He said billion with a B.
He sure did. I thinking say, just a million or a couple.
No,
billion?
billion.
We're spending billions of dollars to allow people to die in communities.
Yes.
When we could be revitalizing and rebuilding communities.
Absolutely.
That's what's trending. It's the Maya Akai Show on
with Nikki Brayton.
That's right, on Smooth 95.5 FM HD. We're gonna take a break, and the Rob G Midday Mix is on to kind of loosen this conversation up.
Yeah, we'll have some fun when we come back. I promise.
Courtside, the matchup you've been waiting for. A field of dreams for some, and a long ride home for others. Sounding so good through the air, it's like you're right there. Folks, you want the score? People, she's got your game. It's the Maya Akai Show, featuring comedian Nikki Brayton. She is pretty funny with your host, Maya Akai. Radio never looks so good.
Don't say maybe.